You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
JT Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Ford,
Corey Dr. O,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mott,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Charlene Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is... Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm super excited to have Carol Dines on the show with me. She has an amazing new book. It's called The Takeover Friend, and this is such a fun book. This is a great mix of nostalgia and a great relationship book and just a fun read from beginning to end. I know you're going to love it as much as I did. Welcome to the show, Carol.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
I'm so excited to have you. Carol, we begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
I think my desire to be a writer goes way back. I kept journals from a very young age, but I lacked the confidence to show my writing to anyone until after college. And then I won a scholarship to one of the first women's writers conferences and dropped out of graduate school and started down the road of writing and ended up going to another graduate program a couple of years later and was well on my way. And since then, I've cobbled together writing and teaching writing as for the last few decades.
I love it. We all have circuitous routes that bring us back around to writing. A lot of writers, talk about having this early desire to tell stories, and invariably life gets in the way. And then, you come back around to writing, but then you get the benefit of looking back and looking at, life experience that you've gained along the way that you didn't know at the time was going to help you as a writer. Have you picked up any things along the way that you now hold dear in your writer toolkit?
I think experience informs all my writing, and I write mostly about what I've come to realize in the last few years is that in different ways, I'm almost always writing about the same subject, which is boundaries in relationships. And I think this comes from growing up in a very close family. I grew up with an older sister who had mental illness. And so the Takeover Friend, I think the origins of that really came from growing up in a family where I struggled as the middle child in a family that was close, and yet we had struggles. I think I've always valued friendships. So all that experience in deep, long-lasting friendships informs my books. I've worked with kids a lot and teenagers. So my experience in the world has a great deal to do with what I'm writing about. I often I still write in journals every day. And I find myself writing daily about things that happen to me. And so when I begin a new book, often those journal writings find their way into the experiences of my characters, the voices of my characters. So yes, I think experience is huge and definitely informs all of my writing.
Well, first off, what genre would you consider to be your go-to? When you're starting a brand new book, do you think in terms of genre, or is it relationships, and then you find a story to tell that will fit that? Or do you think in those terms?
I do. My last book was it was a collection of short stories for adults. And as I wrote those stories over a 3-year period, I knew they were for adults. There was a lot of not poetry, but poetic language. There was experiences that I intended. I think that the stories were all about our most intimate relationships and the boundary within our most intimate relationships. And that moment when we have to contend with our commitment to those relationships or our commitment to ourselves, growing our own lives. And ironically, I realized the Takeover Friend, which from the very beginning was focused for young adults, is also about a similar theme, only it's friendship, but it's also boundaries and families. So I do feel like that when I'm writing for younger people, I'm very aware it has to be a fairly fast-paced book. I think that the plotting has to move very quickly because I feel to keep a younger audience tuned in, there needs to be a lot of dialogue. And I don't consider it action, but my dialogue is often action. And with adult work, I think there can be much more internal dialogue, flashbacks. So yes, I do keep that in mind.
Apart from the writing style of a young adult versus an adult novel, are there themes that lend themselves more to a young adult audience as opposed to a more traditional adult audience? Or are there themes? Are there topics other than just the kind of snappy dialogue and the more fast-paced plotting of the novel? Are there other things that separate those genres and those readers?
That's a great question. I don't think so. I think you can write about anything for a YA audience, but I think my goal is to create layers. And I think the Takeover Friend has several layers. There is mental illness in the family, and there is I think there are layers of understanding about relationships, intimacy. I think that when I write for both audiences, knowing that I want all those layers. I want subtext. I want there to be real depth. But I also know that different readers will maybe not get all of those layers, and that's fine.
You have,
but for instance, let me just go back. I wrote about one of my YA books was about a young singer from a very poor family, and it was based on historical research. And she was a young singer in Rome, and she was sold by her mother to the queen to be the palace singer. And it's a very, very dark book about the Catholic world of the 16th century in Rome. And yet it was it was very well reviewed. And some people said you won't be able to sell this book, but it was published by Harcourt, and it actually had a long life in Europe and was translated into several languages. And there were people who said this will not sell. You can't write about this. But so I think a lot about is how you write about things for younger people and creating layers. So when they're ready to get it, they will get it. And if they're not ready, they may reread it at a different age and get those deeper layers then.
You've published a number of short stories and some collections of short stories, as well as novels. Do you know from the beginning, when you have an idea, that little inkling of the first idea? Do you know that this is going to be a short story, or this is going to be, these are characters that have more of a journey to take than a short story? Do you know that from the beginning?
I have grown to just love the short story form. And what I'm doing right now is writing longer. I'm working on a novel, but when I reach a point of being stuck in that novel, I move to a new short story idea. And in that way, it kind of keeps me from getting stuck. So I always have a couple of short stories I'm working on, and usually a longer piece I'm working on as well.
Gotcha. Do you yeah, I'm fascinated by the very first moment of a story. In one moment in time, the story does not exist in any form or fashion, but then a character walks onto the stage of your mind, or maybe you're reading a news article and the what if game starts playing, and then uh, in some form the story does exist, and then it's your job as the writer to kind of dig that story out and polish it up and make it into what it's going to become. Is there a general first inkling of a story that happens with you? Do you repeat the process over and over, or are they all unique and come from different places?
The beginning of a story, I think, is the most important part. And I think it has to put the reader right into an idea of the conflict that's ahead or the transformation of the character that's coming. And sometimes I know the beginning, and sometimes it comes to me as I'm working on a story or a novel. And oftentimes I will write my way well into the book, and more lines come up, and more uh, ideas. And I often will begin the day by reading a poem, and then I use that poem as prompts to rewrite around the character I'm writing about. And oftentimes, those little jewels that come up will end up being the first line or part of the first page, because they're coming more from my unconscious, I think, but those don't necessarily come as I begin a piece. I don't plot. I definitely work from an idea, what I want this book to be about. And I begin with scenes, and then I begin to shuffle the scenes and weave them into what I think is the transformation of the main characters.
So, Carol, you mentioned a minute ago your book, The Queen Soprano. That book is a work of historical fiction. Could you talk just a little bit about the difference in writing historical fiction versus more fiction with a more modern setting, like your new book? Are there certain pitfalls that you have to navigate when writing historical fiction, and how the thing with historical fiction is that it's based around real events, and some readers are sticklers for those events, and are there special waters that you have to navigate when you're writing historical fiction?
Yes, I do think there has to be the research and um, an understanding of the place and the time. We lived in Rome for 8 years, and at that time, I knew Italian. I've lost a lot of it now, but I spoke pretty well at that time and could read Italian. And this story came to me. I wanted to write a young adult novel about a particular moment in Italian history. So I spent 2 years researching the novel and went to the various libraries. We had friends there who got me into Italian libraries. And this story came to me. There is a very famous queen, Queen Christina, who was born to be Queen of Sweden and abdicated the throne at a very young age and snuck to Rome and became Catholic. And it was a huge worldwide sort of scandal that she was supposed to be the Protestant queen, and she ended up being the Catholic queen. And of course, the Pope welcomed her as a sign of a way to celebrate Catholicism. But she then fell out with the popes because so anyway, long story short, I became enamored with this story. And in her diaries, which Minnesota, because we have a lot of Swedes here, has a huge Swedish library, found the diary of the Frenchman who was her journalist, Queen Christina's journalist. And he wrote about this young woman who was her favorite soprano and how Queen Christina had paid quite a sum to the family. And I won't go into it in any more detail, but I just fell in love with this story. And I wanted to write about the class differences in Italy at that time. Children could be sold. And I wanted to write a lot about some of the hypocrisy in the church. You know, women were banned from performing, and Queen Christina broke those laws and allowed women to perform in her palace. So there were themes I just loved in that story. And I decided to write it for young adults because I thought this is about a 15-year-old. And I thought it was a perfect mix. So so yes, historical fiction takes a lot of research. I did a second book and it didn't work. It was on Margaret Fuller, the first American feminist. And she lived in Rome and covered the revolution of 1848 for the New York Times, fell in love with a marquis, etc. And so she had a great story. But some advice I got from one of my mentors was write this book, write through your writer's block, which for me was terrible advice because I ended up getting very blocked on how to do this historical novel. And I wrote so many versions that I lost the voice. I lost the energy in the book. And it's still in my closet, about 20 different versions. I hope to come back to it at some point, but that was my experience. I couldn't find the right voice to represent her at that moment in history.
That advice that you said, you know, because I hear that advice all the time. You know, if you're stuck, if you're blocked, just write through it, and you'll eventually come out the other side. Your subconscious will take over, or you know, whatever happens. And and some people will say, well, I don't believe in writer's block because plumbers don't get plumber's block, and you know, how professional would it be for a plumber to just not show up one day and say, well, I can't do the job because I'm blocked, you know, and they equate, you know, one thing with the other. If that was such bad advice, in your opinion, what would you wish you would have done? Or what do you see another way through that blocked period that you might have taken?
Yes. And let me just clarify. I don't think it's bad advice for everyone. I think for me, it was bad advice because one of my challenges is I see so many possibilities for every book. And one of the hardest personal challenges for me is to commit to going deep in one way in a book. So at the beginning, you're making all these choices, the voice, the perspective, the time frame. Is it past? Is it present? Are you skipping around in time? And all of those choices come up. And for me, when I hit a block where I'm not sure I've made the right choices, to write it in multiple ways, which is what this friend of mine told me, was paralyzing for me. And I did do it. And I did so many versions that I just couldn't feel the right one. And I couldn't feel the right way forward. Somebody else, that might be great advice. For me, it wasn't about not writing. I was writing, but it was just expanding the possibilities which actually was very paralyzing for me. And my advice would be for me, people like me who have a tendency to see too many ways of doing something, I would say move to another project, take some space, do a lot of long walks, and take the pressure off and let it kind of rise up through your unconscious or subconscious before you go back to it. Because what I've learned since then is that if I do that, if I move on to a short story or an article or something that has nothing to do with the book and begin working on it, all of a sudden I see what I need to do in the book that I'm stuck on. So that's just the advice I give to myself. Oh, yeah.
You mentioned earlier that you're not a plotter. Do you, when you have a moment where you're stuck like that, does it help to kind of sketch out where you see yourself in the story and what might be coming next, or kind of how do you handle? A lot of people that say that they're not plotters will hold, kind of these ideas in their head, and it becomes a sort of a roadmap. You know generally where you're going, especially if you're writing historical fiction. You kind of know at least some of the road markers along the way of where the story needs to go, some events that need to happen. Is it just a matter of finding a way to get to those events?
Yes. I think I always have a glimpse of what I'm writing about before I begin. For instance, with the Takeover Friend, I years ago went through a very hard breakup with with one of my closest friends. And it was a traumatic experience for me. And at the same time, my daughter was going through a very similar experience. And I began talking to people, and I realized so many people go through this experience of really getting enmeshed in a friendship. It's so close and so entangled. It's hard to shift it in another direction, give it more space. And so I knew going in, I wanted to write that, and I wanted to write it for young adults because I think it happens more often. I think it happens with adult friendships too. And I actually have had two adult friends read this book and say, "Oh my God, this is what I went through too." But I think it happens even more often for young adults who don't want boundaries in their friendship. They want to cross boundaries. They're excited to cross boundaries in friendships. And they often don't even know about boundaries until they're crossed. And so I thought that was a great age to sort of gear this book towards.
Your new book, The Takeover Friend. What was that first inkling of an idea for this book? Where did this uh, where was this book born?
Well, it was born back in the breakup of my friendship because I think I always thought afterwards, why did it happen and how did it happen? And I don't think we talk enough about why some friendships end, some of our closest friendships end. We talk about why romantic relationships end all the time. And it seems we have sort of a cultural understanding that does happen and it's normal. You outgrow each other. But with a very, very close friend, we don't have that kind of roadmap for how it happens, why it happens, and what it means in our culture. And so that was the inkling of the idea. Um, as I said, I've taught writing to teenagers in high schools, and I saw a lot of drama around friendship and endings of friendship, but also just tumultuous changes in friendship. So I knew this was fertile ground for a book, and I was excited to get into it. Then the characters came. Sonja came almost immediately to me, and she's a very powerful, brilliant, um, energized young woman who is also extremely lonely and comes from a family that offers her almost no support. And I've known teens like that. So I wanted to represent her, that kind of experience. She's almost too old for high school, in her own mind. And she's outgrown a lot of high school culture before she even gets there. And I also wanted someone like Fran. Fran is very much like I was in high school. She's very sensitive. She wants to have a deep friendship. But her habit is to put other people's feelings ahead of her own. So it's a very symbiotic relationship. And Sonja's so powerful that Fran begins to feel she loses herself in the friendship.
In the beginning, Fran experiences the loss of a friendship. And at that time, when my kids were younger and they were going through this time in school, it seems like emotions are so heightened, and everything seems so immediate, and that it will be everlasting, and then Fran experiences, when Sonja comes in, there's a bit of healing that goes on there, and it's got to be so interesting writing these characters that are kind of at the height of emotions at this point in their life.
And so ripe for transformation. Yes, right. Both. They're open. They want new experiences. It's the first day in high school when they meet. They're at a big high school with all kinds of students. And one of the reasons I chose a large urban high school is because one of the themes is they want to be visible, and they don't want to join. Well, Sonja especially doesn't want to join the typical clubs. She feels a little bit, they both are kind of on the margins. They feel creative and they want to show their creativity. They love poetry. They love music. And then they get this idea for homecoming to build a poetry mobile and to have their English homeroom students all write their favorite poems. And I think that idea that young people, I think most teenagers are lonely. They're growing so fast and they're in new environments. It takes time to find your people. It takes time to find your own grounding and begin to know who you are. And I think that they felt safe with each other. And I think that when young people meet a friend like that, it is huge in their lives. So, so all of that went into this story, and they created together. They felt more powerful and brave in this new school environment.
The bookmobile, the poetry mobile is one of the most fun book inventions that I've seen in a while. Where did that idea come from?
Well, a friend of mine who is a musician has an old band bus in her backyard, and the young people always hung out in it. So probably that was the original idea for it. She and her husband are both musicians. But I also think, I don't know, I suppose it would be something I would love to do. It just came to my mind.
That's so fun. When people read this book, when they get to the end of it and they close that back cover and they've gone through this whole experience you've led them on, what do you hope people are left with?
I would love for readers to know that it's okay if you are in a close friendship and you feel like it's no longer uplifting you, but it is becoming an obligation or a duty, to try to reset the friendship. But if you can't do that, it's okay to end it and let go. And I think so often these kinds of friendships where there's a sort of a power struggle and one person gets swept up into the other young person's needs. I mean, in my book, Sonja ended up being the needier of the two, and Fran really ended up being overwhelmed by Sonja's crises and needs. I think that happens often in teen friendships, where one friend is needier and can overwhelm the friendship. So the takeaway and this is for adults too, this can happen for adults as well, is that, if disappointment and struggle becomes the habit in the friendship, it's okay to try to, communicate around it. But if that doesn't work, it is sometimes a healthy response to let go and end the friendship.
The Takeover Friend is available everywhere now in Kindle edition or paperback. However you like to read books, you can grab it. We're going to have links in the show notes where you can grab it in either format that you like to read in. Carol, if people are just discovering you and want to dig into all the great stuff that you're up to, where can they connect with you online?
Well, my website is a great opportunity, www.caroldines.com. I'm on Facebook, Carol Dines Author, Instagram, and I'd love to hear from people.
Excellent. We'll put links to those places in the show notes to make it easier for folks to find you. The Takeover Friend, go grab it today. You won't be disappointed. Carol, thank you so much for taking time to come on the show.
Thanks so much for having me. It was wonderful.